tell people I've been making mistakes. We should like give it a minute. Should we give it a minute? There's like I'm going to get started in just a moment. Thank you all for being here. ¿Así? Perfecto. Gracias. Listo. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Talia Speaker, and I'm the Executive Manager for Wild Labs at WWF. Welcome to our session on integrating animal movement data into global conservation frameworks. Many of you may have been at our MoveOn launch event last night. Woo! So apologies for any repetition. We want to make sure we cover our bases, but I think we have an amazing group of speakers here today, and some wonderful co-leads. So yeah, thanks for bearing with us. And we are basically going to give a really short introduction to this session and then pass it along to our speakers, and then we'll have some time for open discussion. So I'm here representing myself as well as my co-leads of the session, Lacey Huey, the lead of MoveOn, based at the Smithsonian Institution, as well as my lovely co-leads up here, Andy Bruder of Freshwater Bond, and Joanna Soares and Masa Nakoka of Marine Bond. And Joanna is joining us virtually, but we have our representation on stage as well. That work? So across the globe, animals are constantly on the move. And while they're moving, they're migrating, dispersing, responding to changing environments, and teaching us about the environments that they're moving through. And these movements are really important because they shape ecosystems, they signal environmental change, and they connect disparate populations of wildlife. And thanks to advances in tracking technologies and how much more we can do now in terms of data collection and processing and insights from them, we now have billions of data points that are capturing these movements in really amazing detail. And this is some wonderful imagery from NASA and MoveBank that we're going to hear more about later. So increasingly, these data are providing insights that are interesting and relevant not only to movement ecology and questions within that field, but also to things that matter to society and to managing our natural resources. So things that range all the way from coexistence to global health to planning and sustainable infrastructure. And reflecting this, the theme of movement is actually really broadly reflected in multilateral environmental agreements already. We did a little mapping exercise in the last few years as part of the Movement Ecology Horizon scan that Wild Labs led with the whole group in the community. And we identified that movement is actually a really key component of at least 9 Sustainable Development Goals, 15 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and obviously a central feature of the Convention on Migratory Species. But despite this relevance, Despite this relevance, workflows to actually translate movement data into these frameworks are actually really highly underdeveloped. So that means that even though we see all these connections in the ways that movement data could be contributing, it's actually essentially missing in terms of pathways to monitor and report it under these multilateral environmental agreements. And this was underscored in a really interesting way. It's not going forward. By a publication from 2023 by Timmermans and Kissling, which mapped out the integration of essential biodiversity variables across over 30 global biodiversity framework targets. And they found that that movement is only used in one of them, in one indicator, which is the Protected Area Isolation Index. And because of this, movement also received a very low relevance score in terms of its capacity to inform progress on the global biodiversity framework. And the authors of this publication basically articulated this really nicely, calling out that this low relevance was mainly driven by basically a lack of data being available for use in implementation into biodiversity indicators. And so we really recognize as a MoveOn community that it doesn't have to be this way, that we're actually really primed to address this gap because we already have really widely established data sharing networks. We actually have a lot of movement data that are already available and existing within existing initiatives, but what we're missing is those pipelines to transform those raw data into policy relevant outputs. And so for example, this is a non-exhaustive list, but it kind of represents some of the tools and frameworks that are already existing in the communities. And so, for example, we have, like I mentioned, global repositories for multiple taxonomic groups and regions. We have really compelling demonstrations of the community coming together to share and synthesize data already from these repositories. We have models for sharing data when an open repository maybe isn't appropriate for a certain data set or species. We have functioning examples of Earth observation systems that incorporate data from animal-borne sensors already. And importantly, we have a lot of people doing the sometimes thankless but always important work of standardizing and integrating data across these devices and repositories so that they're usable, some of whom we're going to hear from today. So that doesn't mean that all of our problems are fixed. So despite this tremendous potential, we still have a lot of work to do as a community to scale these ideas across taxonomic and also geographic divides to address these gaps, bridge silos, and actually develop policy relevant workflows that can be used to inform decision making. So basically, that is the kind of thinking behind where MoveOn came from. So I won't go into a ton of detail with this because you heard about the MoveOn launch last night. But essentially, we're here to promote, like a shared understanding of this science policy space for movement, to coordinate across existing initiatives to close the gaps in the data pipelines that we've just talked through. To ensure good governance following fair and care principles so that these data can be used in the appropriate ways, to derive actionable insights for policymakers, and also to really operationalize this and apply it at the national scale in partnership with countries, because we can work to make the best indicator in the world, but at the end of the day, countries need to be the ones to support and integrate this. So really briefly, we already heard about our MoveOn leadership team last night, but this is the team. These are the people who are here in person. And we just wanted to recognize again that this has been really a collective effort from across a whole network of people, over 80 individuals now who are contributing and shaping this initiative. We have 9 interest groups that are already active, so if any of these areas are resonating with you, please do join the community and get involved in these groups. These are the folks who are here today, as well as Laura. And then this is a list of the people who attended our MoveOn development workshop back in March. So just to recognize kind of the scope of efforts that have gone into this already beyond our immediate team. And thank you again to our organizations that have helped to make this happen so far, and also to our funders who are the Smithsonian Institution and NASA JPL. And with that, we're really excited to get into today's session. So just to give a really brief overview, we're going to try to kind of span the remit of MoveBon in this session with short talks, but going all the way from collecting data on devices through to developing products and pipelines that can help actually inform decisions. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Andy first to give a couple of thoughts on freshwater bond. Here you go, Andy.
Yeah, I need the microphone. I don't need the pointer. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Talia. And I'm also co-chair of Freshwater Bond, which is another thematic bond in GeoBond. And as you know, movement data and all concepts and expertise around animal movement are, of course, very important also for freshwater biodiversity. You can think about all the freshwater species that need to migrate to fulfill their life cycles, but also, and maybe that's even the bigger concept, about the very nature of river systems where the connectivity and the ability to move within these systems is of paramount importance. So that's the very nature of river systems, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Masa Nakaoka from Hokkaido University, Japan. I'm one of the co-chairs of MBON, Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. I'm very happy to celebrate the establishment of MoveBon. Yeah, quite a lot of, biologging and acoustic telemetry method has been developed and getting more and more sophisticated, and many organisms movement is actually we can observe. It is really a big contribution to understand the marine biodiversity, and also in the era of climate change, the change in behavior will be a signal for the climate change and other environmental issues we can learn from animals. So it is really important to learn more about how animals behave and migrate, and this is useful for the decision making for the sustainable ocean usage. Okay, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy and Masa. And with that, we're going to get into our talks. So first, we're going to hear from Catherine Jardine of Birds Canada.
Okay, so thank you so much. So as Talia said, I'm Catherine Jardine from Birds Canada, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Stu McKenzie on the MODIS Wildlife Tracking Network today. I will wait for my slides before I start talking. There we go. Okay, so radiotelemetry is simple. You put tags on animals, you listen for those tags, you analyze your data. But MODIS is really taking this further by making the process collaborative. So why just listen for my tags when I could also listen for your tags? So with MODIS, everyone's station picks up everyone else's tags, and all of the data flows back into a centralized data repository and then back to researchers. So this maximizes the impact of everyone's investment and allows tracking at larger scales. And so this makes MODIS a bit of a feedback loop. The network grows. As it grows, the collective benefit and the conservation outcomes increase for all the participants. But the foundation of that is the shared data infrastructure in the form of a centralized data repository and research output tools that make the most of everyone's efforts. And that comes from centralized data management. So this infrastructure includes a centralized tag registration. We've worked with the tag manufacturers directly so that when anybody buys a tag, it's registered with MODIS and used on the network, and there are no duplicates across tags. And then we have consistent metadata entry for receiver and tag deployments, which allows us to standardize the detection outputs, and that facilitates analysis through the MODIS R package. So that infrastructure includes a a fairly complex detection data ingestion pipeline that takes raw detections of pulses and matches them to their metadata that's submitted by users. This has resulted in a consolidated database currently at about 8 billion records, which stresses me out slightly. This massive data repository is already standardized. So it's standardized from the moment the data is collected and can therefore be leveraged in many different ways. So those 8 billion records come from about 1,000 different projects, over 2,000 stations, 60,000 tagged animals across 34 countries. So those records are definitely used by those 1,000 projects for their own individual purposes. However, the power of MODIS is the data is standardized from the time of collection, meaning it has many other potential applications outside of those 1,000 projects. So MODIS strives to meet the FAIR principles, which are baked right into our collaboration policy. Of the 1,000 projects, over 600 are fully open and public, meaning their raw pulse data can be downloaded by anyone. Anyone in this room can go to the MODIS R package right now and grab billions of movement data records if you so wish. A further 200 share summary data, and only 10, so that's 0.01%, are private. And the conservation and research community can access the data in multiple ways. We have a public dashboard where you can explore the data, and raw data can be accessed through the MODIS R package. Data is also being piped into external animal movement platforms. We're working on integration with MoveBank, and we are integrated with Audubon's Bird Migration Explorer. All that data drives research in both conservation and fundamental science. So for conservation, we see vital rate estimation and related parameters. We see threat identification, habitat use, including identifying critical habitat. We look at life cycle, carryover, connectivity, migratory stopover, and ecology. And these are just examples of Kirkland's warblers traveling across North America. And then in fundamental science, we also have physiology and behavior. And our next steps is to make it easier for the public to query and download all of this data. We think at this point that most people don't know that the majority of MODIS data is fully public, and we're particularly keen to see how we can work with MoveBon and those initiatives to help better leverage this resource now that it's collected and standardized. So Birds Canada is working to support targets 20 and 21 of the Global Biodiversity Framework through sort of our two conservation technology platforms. One is Nature Counts, which delivers occurrence data, and the other is MODIS, which is delivering this tracking data. Both systems are really working to mobilize data from targeted studies and facilitate joint analysis across broader spatial and temporal scales. So these are individual projects that then can be grouped all together because of that standardization that analyzed at larger scales. And because of that, collaboration is at the core of these projects. So the MODIS research platform has been leveraged by hundreds of different organizations and researchers. We think that at this point, pretty much every ornithological organization in North America and increasingly groups in Europe and the Global South have leveraged the MODIS network. I really can't acknowledge the contributions of these collaborators enough. MODIS is based on data sharing, and leveraging this resource, we really want to highlight the work of all of these contributors and empower regional leaders and partnerships to secure the long-term vision of the network. And so with that, I would really encourage you to go check out the MODIS dashboard. There's lots of really fun, cool animal movement tracks on there. If you want billions of data records, by all means, go to the MODIS R package and start exploring the data. And I really look forward to working with the MoveBon initiative to see how we can contribute this data resource to actually driving conservation and policy change.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And now we're going to hear from Sarah Davidson, who's representing the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior, as well as Senckenberg. We're going to do questions and discussion at the end, so please just write them down as we're going through.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Just one second. Okay, so I want to tell you all about some ongoing efforts, challenges, and opportunities for mobilizing our animal tracking data infrastructure to inform global conservation efforts. And Catherine gave you a great introduction just now to what are these integrated data platforms for animal movement. So these have developed over the last couple of decades, and they share the characteristics that they offer ways of harmonizing data, offering public discovery, and sharing across institutions. Forgot to click it. As one example, MoveBanks, so I'm the curator for MoveBank. This is a global database for animal tracking and animal-borne sensor data. And it contains data that are stored within about 9,500 user-managed studies. So these are managed and owned independently by 5,000 different users. So these are researchers, these are NGOs, these are wildlife managers. And collectively, these data describe movements and behaviors of about 1,600 species. And as of last month, contain 9 billion occurrence locations. Sorry, I'm not putting this thing. Okay. And I want to also note that there's a lot of live streaming data that are supported. A lot of these platforms support live data streams. So as of, I think this was last September, we had over 33,000 tags live streaming data right into the database as people were collecting them. And so why do people use these databases? And so I want to point out, because this is going to come back, is that these databases primarily have been developed to support the people collecting the data. And so these are some of the services they offer. They are streamlining data collection, and in the case of MODIS, as Catherine described, they're actually enabling the collection in the first place. They offer opportunities to share data, but they give you options for how you want to do that. They enable participation in lots of research initiatives, offer opportunities to meet data availability or data sharing requirements. They offer ways to implement responsive real-time wildlife management. And many offer APIs, which then other people or the platforms themselves can build analysis software that can work with that, and then you can work with that interoperably with anybody else using that platform. And so what are the benefits for the data users? So the two key ones are possibilities for data discovery and data access, where those are public, and then the opportunity to connect with the experts that are collecting those data. And those two pieces on their own are enabling countless local and regional opportunities for research and for conservation. At a larger scale, they're also enabling a growing number of synthesis projects that cross regions, time periods, and taxonomic groups. And then another kind of success I would highlight that have already been brought up are our contribution to the building of migratory atlases at hemispheric and global levels, and Bill DeLuca will be talking more about this one later in this session. But, as has been pointed out before, most of these data are not publicly accessible. So in this paper, we had 8 platform managers. We all kind of compiled our numbers, and across the 8 here shown, only 12% of about 10,000, 9,600 publicly discoverable projects actually allowed public data download. And so what that means is that you can find the data and you can contact the owner and ask them if you can use the data. And this can be really effective. It's a great way to get in touch with people. It's a great way to make sure you understand the data you're working with. But it's also really risky in that we're hosting all of these data, and if it can be so simple as someone's email address changing and no one will receive the requests for use. And so why do we continue to store it? So this is a big deal. And preferentially, this is going to be sensitive species, right? Because those are the ones you would not, for sure, potentially not want to make public. And so let's look at this. Let's look at where we might a first kind of place where we might see gap filling happening with the introduction of movement data into global biodiversity, into GBIF and places, is they have the possibility to fill in gaps in places where we don't have citizen science data and we don't have a lot of research universities and stuff. So let's say the Arctic, okay? So the Arctic Animal Movement Archive is a collection of studies in the Arctic that are hosted on MoveBank. And as of the time of, oh, this is the old version of the slides. Okay, they currently, when it was published, it had about 15 or 16 million locations, and because it's a living data collection, it's now at 62 million occurrences that go back several decades. And these are all people who proactively want to share their data, who joined this collection. And so let's go over to GBIF. So for a different project, so this is not an apples to apples comparison. For this project, I was looking at seasonal differences in animal occurrences in the Arctic, looking at animal occurrences in GBIF. And so while I was doing that, I also thought, well, let's look at like where the data are coming from. And so that's shown in this basis of record, okay? So that tells us what was the source of those data. And if there were tracking data in there, if there were camera trapping data in there, if there were acoustic data in there, they would have the basis of record of machine observation. That's in the other. So they're not here. We have people interested in sharing their data. About half the data in the Arctic Animal Movement Archive are public, and they're not in GBIF. This is not like in scope for this group of people. And so this is why I'm so excited about MoveBond, because I see this as giving us a motivation and a network to build the pipelines we need to mobilize these data for global policy and global biodiversity research. And in particular, I see it as a way to get past key bottlenecks that we've known about that have just been sitting there with us for years. One is it gives us a motivation to integrate our data beyond our movement ecology networks, which are really robust, but they haven't kind of extended beyond that group, to offer an approach to, oh, hang on, there's an opening order. Oh, okay. Sorry, there's some stuff not showing up. Okay, look at where it says data sharing agreements, okay? This also gives us a place to offer an approach to stewarding sensitive and non-public data in order to integrate those as well. And then offering shared pipelines for data processing and mobilization across these different data platforms. And so Peter will be talking more about that in this session. And also, if you see the arrow that's pointing back to the left here, as I also see this as an opportunity for these, this work to start influencing future data collection. Okay, so for the second part of this talk, I'm going to be introducing an example of what indicators and metrics that we can take from movement data and what this could look like. And so I'm presenting this on behalf of Larissa Boehmer, Anna Hertel, and Thomas Müller at Senckenberg, and they have published, so this is online, there'll be a QR code later, the first version, a proof of concept of a move traits database. And so for those not familiar, traits are measurable characteristics of organisms that influence their performance and effects in ecosystems. And so for a typical morphological trait would be a body size, ecological trait, a trophic yield. And so what we're making here is we're calculating from the movement data, we're calculating movement traits. And the cool thing here is that traditional morphology trait databases often have one average value per species. And they're from one measurement taken off of each specimen or each individual. But here we can be calculating them over time, so we can get measures of variation within individuals, among individuals, and then for the whole species. And so in our proof of concept database, we calculate for 149 mammal and bird species some basic movement calculations such as displacement distance and space use. And the other piece here is that we have temporal and spatial information on all of these traits. And so we can also link that to environmental information and look at how those traits vary across environmental gradients, which makes them potentially really useful for lots of policy uses. So here's what this looks like. We have the individual with multiple measures of each individual, and then we have an average measure per individual, and then a species trait summary. And so some of the key features here that I want to point out are that because it's spatiotemporally explicit, it gives us possibilities to assess national trends. We plan to update this because this is a data pipeline. So in this proof of concept, we're taking all of the data from MoveBank, public data on MoveBank, but this is something that can be expanded to take data from other repositories as well. And then we can rerun the code and add more data as more people join it. And so this lets us grow it over time effectively and gives opportunities for detecting recent change. So we're getting the traits a year later instead of a decade later when someone pulls it out of the literature. And then finally, it gives us a possibility and approach to deal with this mass of data that are not public. And so what we're building in right now is a data sharing agreement. It'll be a Shiny app that people can go, and we're going to invite everybody in MoveBank to join this. Did I not switch the slides? Sorry, guys. Okay, so let's take a look at this slide. So the idea here is that we're going to let people come in, we're going to invite people with non-public data and say, would you like to make your derived trait data from your data set public in our Move Traits database? You can be an author. You will know when your data are cited. Every individual level trait has your contact information on it. So if people see that your data are in what they're looking at, they can get in touch with you. And you can choose levels at which you want to expose the data. So you can contribute your data to the species level traits or the individual level traits, but not necessarily the inter-individual level traits. So we're trying to get people used to the idea of like, hey, could you share this information about your data without the raw data? And we think that can overcome some of those possibilities and make a lot more data open. And that is the end. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Just so everyone knows, Sarah had to do 2 talks in one, so she did not go overtime. She was perfectly on time. Did an amazing job. All right, next we're going to hear from Peter Desmet, who's representing the INBO Open Science Lab for Biodiversity.
Hi, I'm Peter Desmet from INBO. I'm going to talk about how we plan to publish 1,000 biologging data sets to GBIF and OBIS, because as Sarah already mentioned, biologging data is used in the movement ecology community, but is very lacking in OBIS and GBIF. So this talk is work by a number of authors who are all here. So if you feel like you want to talk to somebody, all these people, all these names are here. Come up to us if you're interested in joining this initiative. So biologging data, to collect it, is quite invasive. There's an effect to the animals, so we feel like there's a responsibility that this data is used widely, also beyond movement ecology research. And so what we want to do is increase the discoverability and use of this data, while retaining the provenance to indicate where this data is coming from, and have a consistent technique across realm and technique. So whether it is GPS tracking data, acoustic telemetry data, that we use the same techniques in mobilizing this data. So with a number of initiatives, we have written software to ease the transformation to Darwin Core, which is a standard used by GBIF and OBIS. And for example, for MoveBank, we developed the MovePubR package. And what you can see here on the right is you read a data set in, and there's a single function called write Darwin Core, which is going to transform that biologging data, which is in a MoveBank format, to Darwin Core, meaning you can then publish it to GBIF as well, and it can be an underpinning of operational pipelines to mobilize more data. And something similar has been developed for the European Tracking Network with the ETN package, and the Ocean Tracking Network has their own tools to transform data to Darwin Core. And this Darwin core transformation, we've worked together to figure out a way how to transform data consistently. So what we do is an animal tag deployment is one single deployment, that is a parent event. And then there's a number of observations that live under that event. There are human observations, the capture of the animal, the tagging, the release, or the recapture. You don't need to have all. And then there's also the recordings of the logger itself, which are positions, and each position becomes one occurrence. And we felt that there's very high resolution and high frequency data in there that we don't want to flood GBIF and OBIS with. So one of the things we've done is we downsample the data to the first record within the hour. But we indicate that in the data generalization. And for movement ecology researchers who want the high resolution data, they can still go to the source data set at MoveBank or at OTN or ETN to download that data. But as general species occurrence data, I think we think that the 1 record per hour is sufficient to do a lot of research already. All these observations or occurrences share the same parent event ID. And of course, typically for this biologging data that you will not find in other type of data is they also share an organism ID, so you can link them together and create a track. It is also possible, so as Sarah told, there's biometric information attached to, for example, the capture, measurements you took on the animal. That is something you can share to the extended measurement or facts extension, which is also what these functions do. We indicate that information there. So the Move Traits database could use this as another source for trait information about species that is then published all in the same way, not only for MoveBank, but for other systems as well. Regarding governance, so provenance, we really want to make sure that the data set on GBIF indicates well that this is coming from another system. So in the metadata, we indicate this is a sampled down data set in Darwin core from a system, from a data set that you might find in a higher resolution elsewhere. We indicate the DOI of that data set and our data set ID, and the identifiers that are used in the source database, we retain those on those down-sampled information, so you can trace back records in the source database if you feel so. We also want to indicate or acknowledge at least those systems like MoveBank, ATN, OTN, and ATN. Currently, we misuse the term collection code for that. We're looking for a better term to really indicate that system, but that allows on GBIF to search for all data from MoveBank, for example. And what we really would like also in MoveBank is a data set type or an event type that makes it easier to recognize biologging data among all the other data that you have in GBIF. So what can you do with all that data on GBIF? So the MBON, the Marine Bond BioTrack project, for example, has already combined satellite and acoustic telemetry data. And there's also a paper by Boom and Kissling who wanted to compare biologging data with general occurrence data, and they used our R package to convert that data, the biologging data, to Darwin core, which is then easier to compare with the other data. So you don't have to work with lots of different data formats across the systems. You can just use Darwin core for all biologging data. And the other thing I've done here as a fun exercise is I took all the biologging data that is currently on GBIF from 2020 and made a visualization. The pink data is MoveBank data. The yellow data that you can hardly see is European Tracking Network data. And the blue data is coming from the Ocean Tracking Network. The next steps are we want to think about improving this transformation to Darwin core, maybe also think about standards within the biologging community, and think about maybe using Darwin core data package as a way to better express this information. And we want to publish more data, so we really hope that you join this initiative, and we plan to have a hosted portal to really recognize that biologging data on GBIF so you can find your own data sets. So get in touch if you want to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. All right, next we're going to hear from Samra Manzin at the Department of Biology at McGill University.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam. I'm a master's student at McGill University in Andrew Gonzalez and Laura Pollock's lab, and today I'm going to be talking about how and where animals are losing the space to move around the world. So we know that movement is really important for survival. It allows animals to find food, mates, and suitable habitat. But as humans continue to alter the landscape, we still don't know how much space is left for animals to move. We know that human pressure, measured here by the Human Footprint Index, is increasing almost everywhere globally. And we also know from previous studies that animal home ranges and movement decline in areas of higher human footprint. Home range is the amount of space an animal needs to move on a daily basis to meet its energetic demands and can be measured directly from movement data. And as home ranges become limited or smaller, animals can lose the ability to meet their basic needs and persist. So this leads to my research questions, which aim to identify which species and regions are at the highest risk for human-induced home range loss, and if conservation metrics are able to account for these changes. So movement can be difficult to assess on a global scale. Despite the growing amount of data becoming available, we're still lacking long-term tracking studies for many species and regions globally. But recently, two papers by Hurt et al. And Brookman et al. Have modeled the relationship between home range size, species traits, and the environment. And they're the first to show on a global scale that in areas of higher human footprint, animals tend to have smaller home ranges. So we wanted to use this model to assess or predict how mammal home ranges are changing through time as the human footprint has expanded in the past 20 years. And so we assessed this for almost 4,000 mammal species globally, and this allowed us to assess changes across different scales, from averages across species' entire ranges to broken down more specifically within the range. Finally, we wanted to assess how well protected species are to determine which species might need the most attention going forward. So the first thing we wanted to look at was how much species home ranges are predicted to change across their entire distributions on average. So our model predicted that 88% of species are likely to have declining home ranges due to increasing human footprint across their range in the past 20 years. If we look at this plot here, each point represents a species and how it's changed in the past 20 years. And we can see as the human footprint intensifies, we see larger reductions in animal home range size. Most of these reductions are pretty small, with an average of 3.7% seen across all species, but even a small change can matter. For example, a 1-unit increase in the human footprint can mean the difference between a wilderness state and a low-intensity land use state. So identifying where this is happening and which species are being affected is really important. So we can also look at the spatial configuration of losses. This map shows a proportion of species in each area predicted to have higher than average home range reductions, and essentially just highlights where species or communities might be at higher risk for shrinking space. We can also look at a species-specific example. Our model pulls out the Hanen hare as having high probability of home range reductions, with an average of 24% seen across its entire range. And we can look at the variation of these losses and think about what this means for movement. So if animals are losing too much space or it's becoming too fragmented, they can lose the ability to find food, resources, suitable habitat. It can limit their ability to disperse, maintain gene flow, and even persist. So this approach lets us combine these larger scale patterns in human footprint with more meaningful consequences for movement across these scales, from global patterns to species-specific patterns. So finally, we wanted to look at how well protected species are relative to their predicted losses. So first, we identified that 28% of species already have too much habitat conversion within their range to be considered adequately protected by area-based conservation metrics. In this plot here, again, each point represents a species, and as we would expect, we see that the species that are the least protected also have the highest predicted losses. So here, 12% of species fall into our high-risk category, which is, again, the species with the lowest protection and highest predicted losses. And interestingly, these aren't all just large carnivores, as we might expect, because these are typically the most sensitive to high human footprint. But we also see a lot of small herbivores and omnivores, likely because of where human footprint has been expanding in the past 20 years. And this suggests that it could be important to consider species that are less vulnerable, typically to human footprint, because of where these losses are happening, and highlights the importance of considering traits along with the spatial configuration of loss. So to wrap up, we've been able to combine home range dynamics with large-scale changes in human footprint to assess where animals might be losing space in the absence of fine-scale movement data. Using this approach, we've been able to identify which species and regions might be at higher risk for human-induced home range losses, and this could act as an early warning system for spatial pressures on wildlife. Because our model can generalize across space and time, it can be used as a predictive framework on a scale that's relevant to the global biodiversity framework and potentially feed into model-based indicators when fine-scale data might not be available. But primarily, this can help us guide future monitoring efforts to areas where we think movement might be changing the most rapidly and improve our ability to monitor and detect changes in animal movement around the world. Thank you so much to my supervisors, Andrew Gonzalez and Laura Pollack, as well as everyone who's helped me with this project, and the session organizers. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Sam. All right, our next talk is going to be from EOVs from the University of Paris-Saclay.
Good afternoon, thanks for coming. Today I'll be speaking about linear transportation infrastructure networks and how these can contribute to the range shifting potential of, how do I do this? The red one, no? Yeah. So yes, again, talking about linear transportation infrastructure networks and how these networks can help species to shift their range across large spatial scales. So as you all know, climate change forces species to shift their range in order to survive. But at the same time, habitat loss is reducing the velocity of range expansions and making species to lag behind the velocity of climate change in many areas. On top of that, we have created more than 20 million kilometers of roads and more than 1 million kilometers of railways, which are often seen as part of the problem because they fragment habitat even more and are barriers to movement, so they slow down the velocity of range expansion. However, it's not all negative because the verges bordering the infrastructure have been shown to be used by many animals as habitat, and therefore, if oriented in the right direction, may enhance climate connectivity over large spatial scales. But at this point, we are not sure to what extent these narrow strips of habitat can make a difference at the large spatial, can make a difference at the landscape scale. So that's why we used the French railway network as a case study to investigate to what extent natural grassland species can cross the landscape. For that, we sampled 270 replicate landscapes across France, across the French railway network. And we selected those landscapes which we have good verge data for. These 270 replicate landscapes were at the center of the modeling pipeline, which at its core has a range shifter, which is a mechanistic population model, which allows us to capture the movement behavioral processes that are important to define corridor effectiveness. We can visualize the movements, so the simulations, we can visualize them to get an idea of the model behavior for two scenarios, a scenario baseline, where we consider verges to be habitat, not habitat, and a scenario verge, where we consider verges to be habitat. From that, we calculate the velocity of range expansion by taking the maximum y coordinates the population reaches after 15 years of simulations. And yes, we can see that verges can have a big effect on the expansion velocity of animal populations in the landscape. For those landscapes where we have little habitat, is there a pointer here? Wait, that was not the pointer. Yeah. No. Do you have a... So for those landscapes where we have little habitat left, the verges can make a big difference and can increase relative velocity with up to 600 meters per year relative to the baseline scenario, provided that the verges are oriented in the right direction, in this case northwards, so in the direction of climate change. And we can see also that for the verges oriented in the right direction, the proportion of habitat in the verges is important to determine the velocity of range expansion. So in the next step, we wanted to emulate these local, for the 270 landscapes, we want to scale up to the level of France and to the whole network of the SNCF. And that's why we created a statistical emulator where we captured the landscape variables in the 270 landscapes for the two scenarios. And we emulated this relationship to scale up to France for the baseline scenario and for the verge scenario as well. And what we see if we overlay the velocities of the two, of the baseline velocities and the verge velocities, we can clearly see that the verges can help species to cross areas where there is little grassland left in the landscape. So the dark blue areas is where there is low velocity under the baseline, but that the verges can make species to move faster in areas where there is low connectivity. So yes, the net transportation infrastructure verges can be a solution. We hope that by showing where in France these verges are most critical, that we can direct management and we can help the really operators to increase the quality of the verges and that these networks can be important for increasing climate connectivity. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Job. All right, we have two more short talks. Our next one is from Jimena Velez, who is from the Smithsonian in Peru. And then we have one more short talk, and then we'll get into discussion. So start thinking of your good questions now.
Hi, good afternoon. Just to say that it's not going to be only me, it's going to be shared with Vanya. And okay, now I'm going to use more of our seconds. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the opportunity for showing what our efforts in Peru for unlocking movement data and to create a national collaborative system with movement ecologists practitioners in Peru. So this initiative is spearheaded by MoveBon, and it's being supported by the Smithsonian National Zoological Park and Conservation Biology Institute. So we know that movement data is critical for biodiversity conservation and for maintaining connectivity, and it's in all the frameworks that we've discussed over the week. But in Peru, we have no idea of the dimension of the data and the persons that are actually involved in animal movement. So we have four key messages. First, there is dispersed and fragmented animal movement data in Peru, we know that. There is a need and an interest from the government for integrating animal movement data with national conservation priorities. It's in our NBs app. There is a community of practitioners that is ready and eager to connect. And of course, movement is the space and the community, and is catalyzing this initiative at a national level. So to understand, the dimension of the community of animal movement researchers in Peru, what we did is we partnered with the Forestry Service in Peru, that's CER4. We also mine a little bit of public data from the park services in Peru. And with CER4, we launched the first national survey that was initially by invitation. We didn't expect to have the success that it had, because it actually went beyond the invitations of local researchers that we knew, but actually reached to international researchers that are working in Peru. So this survey was 14 very easy questions that were focused on the taxa that they're researching, the tech that are using, the data the platforms that are using to share the data, the needs and the interest. So these are some of the results. We obtained 86 responses that actually were merged into 43 unique answers, because we had a little bit of redundancy of researchers, the PI and the assistants in the field. But we also gathered information from 5 other projects that we knew it exists, but they didn't actually fill the survey. So if you see in the map here, what we found was that the majority of studies are reported in the Andean region as a region, but the higher effort of studies are concentrated in the southern Peruvian Amazon, and that actually reflects, the funding priorities and the accessibility to the area, or the, conservation priorities in the region. When we were focusing on learning about the taxonomic predominance of the data, we of course found that mammals are the most dominant group. I mean, nearly 50% of the studies were focused on following and tagging mammals, but also were birds and sharks and rays. I mean, we did found a little bit of information from the marine realm, and you see some of the species that are here. The Andean bear, one of the most study species, followed by the condor, the Andean condor as well. So the next question is about how the data is being analyzed and shared, and for that I'm going to pass it to Vania.
Thank you, Jimena. Okay. Well, my name is Vania Tejeda. I am biologist, biodiversity specialist at the Smithsonian. And to continue with this information that Jimena explained, most of the data have been not shared because we made some questions to the researchers. And as you can see, people is not sharing their information. No surprise over there. And most of the researchers are analyzing the data, but just privately, then in an independent way. And also they use open source code, like R, Python. So this is really important because they probably need to be about the budget, the project, or also the skills or the capacities of the people. Also, what is the relation with the national biology strategy in Peru? Because how we are going to achieve these big, huge targets in huge conventions around the world if we can be able to put together all these people and talk to them and establish metrics and how to put all this local data, national data, regional data in platforms from the government. And also really interesting that most of the studies have been more promoted by NGOs and local universities, but also the government have a particular role here because they are in charge of the permissions, for example, And since the last 5 years, they have been really active involved in these kind of projects. Most of the participants has less than 2 years of experience, so there is a lot of young people willing to participate, but even if there is a lack of experience, they need probably more guidance to do it. And majority of researchers are willing to participate. So this is really nice because we have like 80 people very willing to talk in the same table and put on the table different kind of subjects or priorities that they consider. This is the question that is about what topics are priority to include in the upcoming workshop. And as you can see, many researchers are really worried about the data analysis, movement ecology, tagging, management. I mean, a lot of how to integrate this data, no? But also we can see the weakness, the policies. Nobody talks about policies. Nobody talks about how to articulate or how to apply this amazing data that they are sharing. And finally, our work as Smithsonian is trying to promote, since our institution and also with Movement of Life, since the last workshop that was made in the beginning of third year in March, it was an inspiration, so Jimena bring this inspiration to Peru, and we are trying to promote this first national workshop the next year. So it's probably a titanic homework that we have to do, but it's an inspiration also to look forward for another species, very overlooked like guanaco, one of the ungulated species that are really endangered in Peru, and don't have a national plan. So if we don't have tools to protect this species and manage this species, probably we don't have any kind of information in the future. So at the same way, we are working in these two subjects, and you're welcome to follow up for the next workshop, the next year in February, our first national workshop about movement ecology in Peru. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, we're going to move to our last talk from Bill DeLuca at the National Audubon Society. Also a warning to all of our speakers, we're going to ask you to come up after Bill's talk is finished, so get ready.
Thanks everybody, long day, we're almost there. I'm Bill DeLuca, I'm the Director of Migration Science at National Audubon Society. So we all know that birds are declining across the globe. Migratory species in particular are particularly vulnerable. They have really complex life cycles. They're often traveling thousands of miles, sometimes over oceans. And that exposes them to threats across hemispheres. So they're really sensitive, and that's one of the main reasons why they're declining. But before we can develop any kind of conservation solutions, we really need to kind of understand some of their basic natural histories. And we don't have that information for a lot of species. And most of the time, that's just because we don't have the technology. This is a 12-gram bird that flies for 3 days over the ocean. And it was only recently, within the past decade, that we were able to track movements like this. So there's a lot of information in a map like this, and it can inform conservation. We can ask a lot of scientific questions, but it also tells a really compelling story that we can bring to the public, we can bring to politicians. Wrong way. So with that in mind, we partnered with all of these institutions here to try and bring this information to the public. So to date, over the past 5 or so years, we've reached out to and gained access to tracking data from over 500 research projects. And the way that we do that is once we get access to their data, we have them put their data on MoveBank. And the way that we access the data then is through MoveBank. And so now we know that that's connected to MoveBond, so that's a really exciting advancement. And then all of this data goes into the Bird Migration Explorer. So this is an interactive website. Right now it represents 191 species. That's about half of all the migratory species that breed in North America. There's a little over 11,000 tracks. It's bilingual, so there's an English version and a Spanish version. And kind of at the heart of this is just simply maps like this where we can see individually tracked animals moving across the globe. You can kind of zoom in, play with it. It's actually really interactive and fun and a nice way to kind of, for the public to kind of engage with migration. Another key piece to this are the connections. So here in this map, I've clicked on Bogota, and you can see all the places across the hemisphere that are connected to Bogota from observed, tracked individual birds. And these are the kinds of maps that we've used to take to politicians to inform policy. So we went to a senator in Alaska and said, hey, if you care about your birds in Alaska, you need to invest in conservation in Latin America. And that led to him co-sponsoring a bill to improve funding and conservation in Latin America. I'm going to skip that one. So that data also goes into inform conservation actions that we do at Audubon and beyond. So this is a conservation reserve network that includes some of that tracking data. And so essentially this is some of the information that we use at Audubon to inform where we work across the hemisphere. It includes tracking data, it includes other data like eBird and some least cost path models as well. And so I'm just going to walk through a couple examples of how we've applied that information. So one is with Conserva Aves. To date, well, the whole point of Conserva Aves is to protect 3 million acres by 2028. And so that full annual cycle reserve network that has tracking data in it has helped to select some of those sites that we can see on the map here. You can see that the progress that's been made to date, we're kind of well on our way to reaching those goals. This is obviously a program that involves several other organizations that you can see at the bottom of the screen there. The last example I'm going to give is about the America's Flyway Initiative. So again, this is a partnership between Audubon, BirdLife, and the CAF Development Bank. And so the idea here is to conserve sites that are needed to secure 10% of species populations. And this is a subset of migratory species, I should say. And that full annual cycle reserve network was used as a coarse filter to select these sites. There were 219 sites that were selected for shorebirds, and then there was another selection process with a little over 100 sites that were selected for landbirds. So I'm just going to wrap up here, keep it short and sweet. Kind of the crux of this problem are taking these really complex, broad, hemispheric scaled processes and scaling them down so that we can kind of inform the work that's happening on the ground at sites. And then to be able to put that site-based work that's happening in these huge hemispheric contexts. You know, what we're doing in one place, like the example I gave you before, that's why someone in Alaska might be interested in investing in Latin America. You are done with talks for today, people. Good job. Thank you. You gotta stay here? Okay.
Thank you so much, Bill. And to the rest of our speakers, please come join us on stage now. We do need to add one chair, so we'll just scoot all of them down a little bit. All right, so now we are going to do a little bit of a discussion time, but we want it to be driven by all of you. So we have some questions, but the floor is open for all of you. Any questions in the crowd? Okay, I see one out there. We need the microphone. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, do we have any other questions so we know who we're going to next? Okay, over here, one back there. Great. Thank you.
It's for the translation. Thank you so much. It's very exciting to see so much progress in terms of data sharing and curation. My question is a general question for all of the speakers. Have you come across any data with vertical location information for the species? For example, arboreal species, living trees who are underrepresented in studies, or height information for birds? And if there are, how can we find it? Thank you.
Vertical.
I'll take a stab at that first. So the geolocator map that I showed you in the beginning of my talk was based on light level geolocators. And so we have a project that we're starting now on blackpolls, Swainson's thrush, Bicknell's thrush, those are all boreal species. And it uses pressure, it's a pressure logger, so it uses barometric pressure, that's what it logs, and it gets altitudinal information down to 10 meters, and the spatial resolution is about 10 kilometers, so we're using that on a project to inform offshore wind sighting for songbirds in the Atlantic and in the Gulf. We're putting them also on prothonotary warbler and Swainson's warblers.
Very similarly, we're working on developing an altitude tag for the MODIS network as well for similar purposes and looking at offshore wind energy. We've also looked at detection distances and how they change with the altitude the different species fly. And there was one paper that was looking at exposure to wind energy facilities based on flight height for different species. So lots of different applications of that vertical height as well.
So I would say like most modern GPS sensors are also delivering some type of altitude estimate. With GPS, I don't know about the quality, but you could do, there's definitely a lot of those data out there. People who you might ask to share your data, they might not consider it important. So sometimes it actually you have to help them integrate that back into their data or tell them you want the full version. And also, I don't know about, for marine, the depth is often, there's more depth information than there is location information. So there's tons of vertical movement in the marine space.
Yes, and I was actually going to mention the marine one. When you are tagging, for example, we're tagging cormorants and penguins, and we use accelerometers. And in addition to the GPS location, we have the depth, and we use other sensors combined to measure, for example, for temperature and salinity. And so we have all these like vertical information integrated in addition to the position.
All right, thank you. I think we have a question back there.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really a great initiative, I think. And there's definitely scope. I'm part of EcoCode, and there's lots of scope for synergies between here and EcoCode within GeoBon. So my question here was, how deliberate is it to restrict this to animal movement? I mean, if we're going to have MoveBon, it would be great if it was integrating organism movement data, because we know that plant seed dispersal, pollen dispersal is highly sensitive to weather, to climate change, also to land use change. The same will be true for plankton. We know that animal movement can influence how lots of plant seeds can be moved around. So it would be a shame, I think, if this really did just continue being restricted to animal movement.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll pass it on to the panel, but just to say, I think I had at least 7 people come up to me last night at the MoveBon launch event last night, asking if their specific thing that they study was going to be included in MoveBon. And I think the part of the scope right now is like we're figuring that out, and we're figuring out what this should look like. We had a great lunch today talking about EBVs and like how we integrate all of these different data types and sources and at what scales. And I know that there are ways to do that, and that's exactly what we're thinking through. So, but I think it's helpful to have people who are bringing up, you know, this piece is relevant. We have had conversations about plant movement, and initially decided that, at least for the beginning, there's so much in like tracking data that are already, as was discussed a lot, that is a good low-hanging fruit, kind of, still a lot of work, but a good initial challenge that we want to focus on, but that doesn't mean it's going to be limited to that. But Sarah, do you want to add anything? No? Oh, okay, forget. Does anyone else want to say? Or your opinions on what MoveBon should include? Yeah.
There's definitely animal movement studies that are looking at dispersal of seeds, right? So there's also like some overlap there. But yeah, I mean, we would totally welcome you to join, and because partly like we need some people to bring it. Like this isn't our expertise of the group working so far, but if someone like has ideas, absolutely show up. We would be super excited. So.
Yeah, I have the same thing with MoveBon. I always think animal tracking data, as in biologging data, but I also, for example, work with radar data, which is very good at detecting movement, but not at like individual level or at the species level. And yeah, I think we should be considerate of all these other type of technologies that record movement as well. So yeah, across species and across technologies. But it's so easy to just think like, yeah, it's biologging data, but it's more than that.
I think it's another cool reason to have GBIF as kind of a center point as far as the data goes, because then we have a space to integrate all of it, once we have the capacity for it.
Great. Other questions in the room? Antonio?
Yeah, I will take advantage of having so many animal movement experts in the room to ask this question that I ask myself, which is, what is the advantage of animal movement regarding the other modalities for biodiversity? Now there is acoustics, there is camera traps, there is different modalities. So, maybe you can address this question on the way that we collect data, that we federate data, and also what is like the biodiversity problems, including, related to climate change, that the animal movement is more adequate than other things, like, field inventories, acoustics, and so on.
That's a great question, and one that we had too is like, what's the unique thing that all of you are working to get out of animal movement data? Anyone want to go first?
I can give a couple of examples. So I think I mentioned it in a previous session. So for example, for defining important areas for sharks and rays, movement data was critical to delineate the polygons that are important corridors. So it was the movement data, but it was put in another context to recognize important areas that might feed into, for example, marine spatial planning or marine protected areas. On the other side, other experiments that we have, for example, using movement data, it's, the basic question is about residents, for example, but how infrastructure affects movements, or how animal movement can give us a clue or a proxy of foraging resources that are also important for other systems. So we're trying to use movement to integrate it with other needs or other questions that we have that are not only related to how animals move. If that.
So from the Canadian perspective, not a lot of our birds stay there all year. It gets snowy and they leave. And we see variations in population change within Canada. Some areas for a given species are increasing in population, some areas are decreasing in population. And for us, a lot of this movement data is about migratory connectivity and trying to identify drivers of change. So for example, we have limited resources. We could pour all those resources into doing habitat restoration on the breeding grounds in Canada, but if we use movement data, we might actually see that, the population that is declining is using this wintering area, and the population that is increasing is using this wintering area, and our resources would be better spent on the wintering areas or on a stopover site. So it's more about trying to make sure that we are, if we're seeing declines, that we're identifying like the drivers of change across the full life cycle. The other thing that I'll just add is they're not mutually exclusive. So you mentioned ARUs. We've started to pair ARUs with MODIS stations as well, so that the investment, to your point, that is going out into the landscape is being maximized, so that those stations are both listening to radio pulses and to songbirds and sound.
From my perspective, most working with big mammals, for example, I know that it could be a little invasive to use right now telemetry instead of ADNA or acoustics, but in my experience with tapirs or spectacle birds and other researchers working in Ecuador and in Peru, they established that these animals choose their corridors, choose the trails. Once they go up on the mountains, they look freeze there all the landscape and choose which trail they're going to choose that day, the route, no? And why they decide this? Because the landscape is really fragmented. So the behavior of a species in a conserved landscape, in a national park, in a protected area, probably going to change drastically in a very fragmented landscape, because there are agricultural systems, roads, and different kind of things, and animals knows that, and they need to cross that. So at some point, I need this information. It's really necessary, because each animal will take a different decision of the other, depend of the necessity, depend of the area, the landscape. So at some point, we need to know which are the factors that make this animal took that decision. So from my perspective, it's really useful, and we need to continue to achieve, to know what happened with these animals and why they take these decisions.
So 2 points. To me, like camera trap data, acoustic data from, like static in situ locations, I think that is still in scope for MoveBond, because we can get arrival times, departure times, we can get evidence of range expansions. So I think that's in scope. The other thing I would say, as far as like the biologging data, I agree with what everybody else has already said, but I think in addition, the idea of being able to get behavioral metrics. So we can detect when animals are born, we can detect when they're killed, we can detect predation events, we can detect infections, and we can also get the behavioral information can tell us what the animal is doing in the ecosystem at a particular time and space. And so we can get information on, behavioral, functional biodiversity as well. And I think that's kind of a unique thing to the biologging data that I would add.
Basically, I agree with everyone, but just to say, like, you can attribute change with movement data in a cool way, where you can try and attribute change to specific pressures, like roads versus infrastructure versus population, that you might not be able to do with other types of data.
That was going to be my brief follow-up to that question, actually, is like, I think we heard a lot about the value of movement data for ecological questions and for conservation management, but like, in the lens of talking to national governments about why they should care about movement data and how it's important to the things that they are committed to and are struggling with in their contexts, I'm also wondering, like, from Sam in terms of the human footprint context, and then also from Yob on infrastructure and others, like, what are the things that would make a country, want to invest in knowing where their movement data are beyond these foundational ecological questions?
So yes, obviously governments could be interested in movement data as to determine the collision risks for railway infrastructure, for instance, or for highways. So in this case, that would be very relevant to invest in this. And there's also quite lots of questions how to plan infrastructure mitigation works, and that involves predicting where species will come close to infrastructure. So that involves more than only movement data, but also the relationship with the landscape and the behavioral interaction with landscapes. So then it can be determined where collision risks are high and where you can mitigate the risks most effectively.
Great. Any other questions in the room? Yes. Looks like we have one in the back and then up here.
Where am I going?
Hello, thank you. I'm Bart Appleton's head of OBIS, working for IUC UNESCO. In IUC UNESCO, we also have the Global Ocean Observing System, or GOOS, which coordinates the ocean observations and makes sure that countries work together in ocean observations and making sure that there is an agreement that allows sensors to go into the EEZ of the countries. There's a whole Argo system. When an Argo float enters an EEZ, there is a message that tells the country that there is an Argo float from country X entering your country, so that there's a notification system. So I wonder how does that work on land? Normally you have you need to have the authorization of a country to do scientific research. So for animal tracking, do you ask authorization for countries to have your tags entering their countries and collect data? Or is this not very coordinated or regulated yet?
Good question. Yeah, one of you.
Yeah, my answer is no. Like, one of the things for MODIS in particular is we are talking about very small flying organisms, and these are only admitting tags. They're not receiving tags. So, like, these are put on dragonflies, and like they're very, very tiny, so they don't have the capacity to alert. So it's not something that has ever really even crossed my radar. Pardon the pun.
And just to add, yeah, I mean, you have to go through the permitting process when you're attaching the loggers, but the part of the reason why we're putting them on is because we don't know where they're going. And so we wouldn't even know where to get that permission from until they get back. It's an interesting concept. I honestly had never thought of that before, but yeah.
So, like, feeding into that birds as spies and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would also add, yes, so they don't, there is no mechanism that, you know, because there's lots of ones where we can collect, we see the data as they're moving, right? So we could see that the bird has gone from the United States into Mexico. There's no mechanism by which anybody would know who to contact, or like there's no way to deal with that. There are some interesting stories that have been in the media of countries finding tagged birds and accusing another country of spying. So, like, this has been a diplomatic issue before a handful of times.
All right, I think we had one more question up here. I think this will be our last.
Okay, I'm coming at this from like a species distribution modeling perspective, I guess. And like it's obvious that movement data has a lot of potential for filling spatial gaps in biodiversity data, and it's super cool that it's getting integrated into GBIF now. But I'm wondering if there's any like potential issues with just treating this type of data in the same way as classical occurrence data. Like I can imagine maybe you should be treating it differently in models, and I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but yeah, I think they should be marked differently so that at least when you're doing your research, you can see like, oh, these are all machine observations. And I would like to even go beyond that, saying that these are GPS tags, this is camera trap data, this is bioacoustic data, so that as a user, you can decide what to do with that data. I don't have the answer how to analyze that, but it should at least be there and recognizable. So it's not like, oh, I'm just taking for this country, what are the most occurrences? Oh, it's this gull because it's one individual that was tracked and generated lots of occurrences. That's like a very poor way of doing it. But yeah, by just identifying that these are different types of data, I think it is possible to allow to use that differently in your analysis.
I'll just say real quick, it's not that common to see migration information in species distribution models. There's so many different like climatic and habitat niches that they're moving through. It's very difficult. The data isn't considered like independent occurrence data. There's spatial and temporal autocorrelation issues. There's like specific movement models that address that. But I'm excited for that to like move into that kind of field. I think we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, I would add, I think one of our jobs as MoveBon, and especially in this idea of making this hosted portal for tracking data, is to guide the people publishing into how do you make sure, so we're going to use the organism ID so people can see that's 1 million points of the same animal, it's not 1 million individuals, and then we're going to need to maybe provide some guidance on the user side to show, like, here's how you're going to want to, you know, we're not going to advise on the modeling probably, but like, you know, here's how to make sure you're getting the right sample size and adjusting as you need. So there's a little bit of, I think, just documentation on our end and also getting feedback. But yeah, I mean, that concern is like one reason that I have been slow to try and push to get movement data into GBIF, because I'm concerned, like, well, what if we show a bunch of increasing trends that aren't really there, it's just that we've added data, and then I had people tell me, like, please put it in GBIF, and that's not your problem. So, but I'm glad because I have the same concern.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of our amazing speakers. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Before we wrap up, a couple of really practical things. There are more informational materials on the front tables here if you want to come find out more. There's also a QR code on them that will take you to the MoveBond website. But I wanted to say, because we didn't make it very clear at the launch event last night, the way that you can join MoveBond is by making an account on GeoBond or going to your current profile and then scrolling all the way down and just checking the MoveBond box. And by doing that, you're going to be automatically signed up to our emails, and you'll get communications. You can also email any of us, but that's the simplest way to do it. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hopefully working with many of you. Thanks, everyone.